Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Mark had always been a methodical man. For more than 20 years he woke up at the same time, brewed coffee for Denise before she left, and never ended the day without checking every detail around the house. He thought that was enough, that this care, this consistency, would hold back any storm. But little by little his body started to fail. First came the lapses in memory, then the dizziness. During an ordinary week, like so many others, he passed out in the bathroom. Denise found him on the floor with a cut on his face. The diagnosis came fast: dangerously high blood pressure, almost fatal. And along with the medicine came the side effects. Mark lost his appetite, his sleep, and worst of all, his sexual function, a direct hit to his ego, his self-esteem, the man he thought he was. The first talks with Denise about it were delicate. She tried to dodge, said it was understandable, that his health was what mattered. But Mark noticed how she avoided touch. Hugs got brief. Kisses turned into a formality. And in the end, the silence between them lasted longer than any conversation. He blamed himself, thinking he was failing as a husband. He tried to make up for it with flowers, gifts, an improvised dinner, but she looked bored, as if his presence were a burden. The house that once pulsed with their rhythm now felt like a space shared by two strangers. Denise started changing her schedule. She left early and came home late, saying she needed time alone, that she was tired of the domestic routine, that she needed to breathe. Mark tried to understand, telling her she had every right to live, to distract herself. But inside, he bled. He watched her from afar, sometimes standing in the hallway, phone in hand, laughing at something she read, and felt a pain no pill could fix. He noticed she spent more time getting ready to go out than to be with him, different perfumes, bolder makeup, wardrobe changes with no explanation. Instinctively, something inside him switched on, something he wished he hadn't felt. One random Saturday, while he was washing dishes, he watched Denise rush out, saying she was meeting a girlfriend. A vague excuse, no details. Hours later, when he took out the bathroom trash, he found a crumpled packet of personal lubricant gel. He was startled. They hadn't touched each other in over a year. That image burned into his memory like a wound. From that point on, Mark's eyes stopped being only those of a sick husband. They became the eyes of a man losing everything he believed he could control: fear, a kind of emotional paralysis that left him frozen. He still had no proof, but deep down he already knew. Denise wasn't the same. And maybe, come to think of it, she never had been. As weeks went by, Mark started losing weight. The doctor said it was from the medication, but he knew it ran deeper. It was the pain of lying next to someone who drifted a little farther away each night. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine. He smiled at Sunday lunches with the kids, praised Denise's cooking, watched TV beside her, all with a stone on his chest. The physical impotence was smaller than the emotional one. He couldn't reach her anymore. It was as if they spoke different languages. And he tried, every day hunting for a crack, a chance, a spark of affection. But she was distant, as if just waiting for the right moment to leave. On the last night of that month, when he got out of bed for water, he saw Denise's phone buzzing on the dresser. She was sleeping deeply, oblivious to everything. He picked up the phone and the screen was still lit with a strange name, just a nickname. Sean. He opened the chat. And there, between emojis, provocative words and inside jokes, he understood: every outing, every excuse, every cold stare. It all made sense now. He didn't feel anger. He just put the phone back, went to the kitchen, drank his water in silence, and looked around the house, seeing nothing but a place where his presence no longer mattered. He went back to the bedroom and watched Denise sleep for a few minutes. He thought about waking her, asking questions. But what would that get him? He knew that if he spoke right then, she'd hit him with justifications, and he didn't want excuses, he wanted respect, dignity. And maybe that was exactly what she could no longer give. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every year lived beside her, the trips, the laughter, the birthdays. It all felt so distant, as if it belonged to another life, another couple. And when the sun began to slip through the curtain, he made a decision. He still didn't know how, but he'd get out of this with his head high, even if he had to lose everything, everything except his dignity. Mark woke up with heavy eyes and a body more tired than usual. When he turned, he saw Denise on her side, sleeping peacefully, as if nothing in the world were wrong, as if the messages from the night before were just a silly joke among friends. He got up, showered, dressed slowly and made coffee like he always did. When she walked into the kitchen with her hair up and a clean face, he wondered if he'd imagined it all. Maybe he was exaggerating, maybe he was creating a monster where there was only frustration. But it took just one sentence for everything to collapse again. She sat down and casually said she'd be going out later that day. When Mark asked where, she just smiled and said it was her business. In that lukewarm smile he felt the contempt, the kind of smile you give when you owe no explanations. He wanted to confront her, but he took a deep breath, swallowed it like something that poisons you slowly, finished his coffee in silence and went to handle other chores around the house. Inside, a storm was brewing. For the first time in decades, he felt there was a wall between them, a wall he hadn't built but now had to figure out whether to tear down or walk away from. That week he booked dinner at the restaurant where they'd celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. She agreed to go, but spent the whole time staring at her phone, laughing at messages and replying without a word. Mark, pretending not to notice, tried to keep a conversation going, brought up old stories, talked about the kids, the future. Denise limited herself to nods and short answers. When the main course arrived, she said she had to leave early, and she left, leaving him there with the bill, the memories, and the certainty the problem was bigger than he had imagined. That night Mark gathered his courage. He waited for her to come home and, straight out, asked if there was someone else. Denise let out a restrained laugh, as if the idea were ridiculous, and asked if he was paranoid. He held her gaze, said he knew, that he'd seen messages, that he'd figured it all out. She stopped, stared at him for a few seconds, folded her arms and let out a sentence he'd never forget. "I love you, Mark. But you can't be a man for me anymore." He didn't answer. He felt his throat tighten but stayed standing, motionless. She went on, saying she needed it, that she had desires, that she was too young to live like a widow inside marriage. She said the other men meant nothing, they were just tools, like vibrators with legs, and that he shouldn't feel betrayed because she was still there, beside him, taking care of him, being a wife. Every word sounded like a gunshot. She spoke naturally, with conviction, without asking forgiveness. She said it was all an adjustment, a way to keep the marriage alive. No emotion in the encounters, only physical need. If he were healthy, maybe none of this would be happening, but since he wasn't, she had to look outside for what he couldn't give anymore. Mark stayed silent, listening the way someone hears a death sentence. Even so, he kept his eyes fixed, not out of pride, but because he didn't know what to do with his hands. Denise went back to the couch, turned on the TV and acted as if they'd argued about dinner plans. Mark climbed the stairs, went to the bedroom and locked himself in the bathroom. He sat on the edge of the tub and felt the world spin. His head throbbed, his chest hurt, and for the first time he thought about giving up on everything. What destroyed him most wasn't that she'd cheated. It was the lack of remorse, the way she treated her lovers like objects, how she talked about her own sexuality as if he were a disposable obstacle. The woman he'd sworn to love and honor for life had turned into someone who saw him as a burden. During that night Mark thought about many things, about leaving, disappearing, getting revenge. But none of the ideas felt right. What he really wanted was to understand exactly when she stopped seeing him as a man, when she started looking at him like a half-functioning invalid, a convenient companion instead of a partner. His body had limits, sure, but his heart still beat hard, still loved, still wanted. And she'd buried all that without even letting him know there was a funeral. At dawn Mark took his pill, made the bed and went out for a walk. Denise was still sleeping, with the same calm face she wore every morning. And for the first time, he didn't want to wake her with a kiss or a coffee. He left in silence, a sentence stuck in his throat: "You killed the man I was, and you didn't even notice." Mark spent weeks acting like everything was in place even though he knew it had all crumbled inside. He moved slowly, like someone who'd learned to hide the weight he carried so as not to raise suspicion. Denise kept up her routine arrogance, and that made it easier for the plans he was putting together. For years he'd believed silence was a way to keep the peace. Now he understood silence could also be the sharpest weapon. He was no longer the man who needed answers or the husband desperate for attention. Now he was a strategist. The first thing he did was redo the will, quietly. He went to the notary's office, talked to the lawyer, and in less than 3 days Denise was cut out of everything. Every asset, every dollar, every cent was redirected to the kids, and even that had safeguards. Mark built clauses that protected both children from any future attempt by their mother to get close for gain. Neither of them knew it yet, but everything was being done with them in mind. Mark could accept losing a marriage, but he wouldn't let Denise ruin the kids' future with the same coldness she used to wreck his life. The second move was hiring a lawyer who specialized in complex divorces. He didn't look for just anyone. He found a professional known for acting with firmness, discretion and surgical skill. After seeing the evidence, recordings, message copies, photos, the lawyer needed seconds to conclude Mark had every legal reason to leave the marriage without losses. Denise, who had always prided herself on controlling everything, had no idea she was already completely boxed in. Mark also reorganized their banking access. He transferred investments to shielded accounts and closed every loophole she could exploit, and he removed her authorization for joint transactions. All done quietly, leaving no visible trail. She kept thinking he was the same passive, tired, slow man. But behind those calm eyes, a plan was unfolding, every detail thought out with cold precision, not for revenge, but for justice. Meanwhile Denise carried on as if she owned the world. She came home with new shopping bags, tossed out shaky excuses, and sometimes even joked with Mark, asking why he was so quiet. He just smiled. The same mouth she'd soiled with filthy words now smiled with poise, and that confused her. She didn't see what was coming. She thought silence meant weakness. It didn't. It meant preparation. One afternoon Mark decided to test her reaction. Over lunch he casually mentioned wanting a new life plan, selling the house, simplifying things, traveling on his own. Denise scoffed, saying he couldn't even shop alone at the supermarket. What kind of plan was that? Mark just looked at her and smiled. He didn't argue, because right then he was certain, she really believed she was in control. And that was his greatest advantage. Later he went upstairs to the office and printed one last document, the formal start of the divorce proceedings. He slipped the paper into a brown folder, set it on the desk and took a deep breath. There was no room for doubt anymore. The woman he once loved was now just a shadow of what she had been, and everything he'd built was at risk if he stayed. He knew Denise would react with fury, maybe cry, scream, accuse him of cowardice, but he was ready. Assets safeguarded, kids informed, lawyer on point. It was only a matter of time. That night Denise came home smelling of another man. Mark recognized the cologne. It was the same scent he'd noticed in the car when he'd grabbed a folder she'd left in the back seat days earlier. And right then he felt something different, relief. Because he was already free. She just didn't know it yet. When Denise opened the front door and found Mark sitting at the table with a folder of documents in front of him, she thought it was just another talk about finances. She dropped her purse on the couch, kicked off her shoes and asked what he wanted. Mark pointed to the chair and asked her to sit. His voice came out calm but firm, no raised tone, no hesitation. He said this would be their last conversation as husband and wife. She laughed, as if it were a joke, and asked if he was kidding. Mark opened the folder, pulled out the papers and slid them to her. One look at his face told Denise there was no doubt. She picked up the documents, read the first paragraphs and tried to keep her composure, but her hand shook, her expression changed, and for a brief moment she went silent, a silence Mark had waited for years. When she finally spoke, her voice was louder than she meant. She wanted to know why, as if she had the right to ask questions. And Mark answered. He said he had proof, that he knew everything, that he'd just been waiting for the right moment. He told her he'd watched the videos, listened to the recordings, read the messages, that he'd analyzed every detail calmly. He said he didn't feel anger, only contempt, and a deep pity for having shared a life with someone who saw him as a burden instead of a partner. When Denise finished reading the papers, her voice thick and her hands shaking, she got up from the chair with a lost look. She walked to the couch, sat for a few seconds, then stood again. She opened her mouth as if to say something but gave up. The silence between them became a wall. She asked if this was final. Mark just nodded, no aggression, no sorrow, just firmness, and told her the paperwork was already filed and the lawyer would handle the rest. Denise tried to argue, begged for one last talk before anything was done. She said she needed time to process, that maybe they could find a less drastic way to solve it. Standing, Mark looked at the woman who'd shared nearly 3 decades at his side and replied with the calm of someone who'd already cried all he could, "You had time. Way more than I did." She was the one who left that night. She grabbed a few clothes in a rush, stuffed them into a small suitcase, called a friend and slipped out in silence. The door closed gently, without a slam, as if even the house understood something had ended. Mark didn't walk her to the door. He just waited to hear the car drive off and then went to the bedroom. He looked at the empty bed and felt relieved. For the first time in a long while, he breathed without feeling the weight of her presence beside him. In the following days Denise tried to come back. She showed up unannounced with a rehearsed speech, saying she needed to grab more things, that they had to talk. Mark let her in but was clear, "You're here to take what's left, because there's nothing of us left." She cried, begged, knelt in the hallway of the house that had once been the stage for her hidden humiliations. But Mark had already gone through that morning. She wanted to return when there was nothing left to rebuild. He was the one who stayed in the house, not out of attachment to the property but out of fairness. He had paid for every brick, handled every bill, maintained every inch of that home. And she, who treated it all as a lifelong guarantee, left with one suitcase and the weight of her choices. Denise walked away believing she could still manipulate the ending the way she had the middle. But Mark had already freed himself from the guilt. The divorce moved quickly. Every clause was already set to prevent any contest. When the judge signed the final decree, Mark didn't celebrate. He just took a deep breath and moved on. She left. He stayed. But the one who really walked away was him, because she, even at a distance, would stay trapped in everything she'd done, and he now walked light. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.